Just introducing our last speaker, and we have had a very long association with Connor Parker, Director of Advocacy Campaigns at the Agenda Group, and the document that is before you today has been prepared, and there's a lot of work gone in. RCV has worked with the Agenda Group since October last year, and in that time they have assisted us to develop both our budget and election advocacy campaigns. So if you could welcome Connor just to bring us up to speed with where we're at before we call it a day. So thank you, Connor. Right.
Hello everyone, I know we're at the end of the day, so we'll try and fly through what I've got to say. Last time I was here was quite a few months ago now. I was talking about the strategy around our budget submission. Since then, obviously the budget has been and gone, and we had some successes and also some feedback. One of the key approaches we took into that messaging was having a look at how we talk about the projects that are important to rural Victoria. And one of the key things we did was talk about, make sure we put the focus on rural communities. How are the projects that we are advocating for affecting our whole communities rather than just talking about local councils? Because local councils are an incredibly important part of their communities, and demonstrating that impact beyond just our own organisations is an important part of how we were framing those projects. In the lead up to the submission that we have pulled together for the state election, we've taken that further, and we've done a few key things there. The first one is developing messaging consistency, and I'll also talk a little bit today about how we've applied that to our state campaign, and even though we're still coming up to the election, getting prepared for what's next, what happens afterwards, making sure that we keep moving forward beyond the 24th of November. So in terms of messaging consistency, what are we talking about? We're talking about that when the government and politicians, the opposition, independents, minor parties are speaking to rural councils Victoria, it's important that we try and have some consistency in the key messages, the key themes that we're talking about. This is helping to demonstrate that our priorities and the things that we're asking for need a long-term serious investment from government. These are not often priorities that can be bought off in one budget cycle. This is not a group of councils that is looking for a quick fix. Many of the issues and the projects that we are presenting require long-term investment from governments and politicians in all sides. And that consistency helps demonstrate that. The challenge of this is rural Victoria is one of Victoria's, if not Victoria's, most diverse regions. We have very small towns, we have some larger rural areas with different economies, different communities, different environments, and a range of projects within those. Infrastructure, roads, rail, small, large community centres. How do we develop consistency when we have such an enormous range of different places and spaces and projects? So what we've looked at therefore is how do we focus on issues and making our issues consistent and the issues we talk about consistent rather than just the projects. So often these markedly different projects that we're looking at and the projects that we've pulled together in this election platform are quite different on the surface, but they're responding to those same key issues. And having consistency in those issues and the messaging that we talk about them is important in delivering not only a greater understanding when we're talking to politicians, but really getting down to the nuts and bolts of what are the key challenges that are facing rural Victoria that we're trying to resolve. So as an example of how this works, if you look through the platform document, you notice one of the key asks is for a community spaces fund. And this is a new ask that came up in the platform compared to the budget component and was initially appeared to have a somewhat different focus to some of the asks we've had before. And this is true for a lot of projects. There are many, many good initiatives across rural councils that may not fit into some of the other asks that we've had before. So how do we create messaging consistency for this? How do we make it fit into some of the arguments that we're making when we're talking to government about why we need investment in a project like a Community Spaces Fund? So what we did, we burrowed down to the core issue that this issue is responding to, and when we're talking about the project, when we're advocating for the project, that's the language we use and that's the issue and the value that we start with. So what does this look like? Well, we'll break it down. Why do we need a Community Spaces Fund? To make better public spaces for residents and businesses. So that's the first kind of layer. That's pretty obvious. But I think we can keep going deeper to get to the real core issue of this one. So why do we need better public spaces for residents and businesses? To create more livable rural communities. When we have good public spaces, when we have good spaces for businesses to operate in, we have more livable communities. Well, why do we need livable rural communities? Well, because people move to and invest in desirable communities. And we've gotten to that level where we've got a key common theme that resonates with a lot of the other projects we're talking about. We're talking about how do we get people to move to and invest in rural Victoria? How do we make rural Victorian businesses strong? How do we make sure that while we may have the jobs in some areas, we get workers moving to those areas? Places where we don't have jobs, how can we spur investment? Those kinds of key messages underpin this ask, and by making sure that we frame things like the Community Spaces Fund in those key messages, we can have a level of consistency. So when we're talking to government, we're not just talking about here's the Community Spaces Fund, here's how you should, here's why you should respond to this ask. We're talking about, we're looking at ways and opportunities to resolve some of the employment, business and population challenges in rural Victoria, and this is one of the ways we can go about doing that. It's a message that they've heard from Rural Councils Victoria before, and it's a message they'll continue to hear. So while the projects may change, even if we have success, even if we have them funded, we can still come up with opportunities to resolve these key challenges that we're facing in rural Victoria. So what we did is in that document, we now have a category where some of these projects fall under, which is livable communities. And the message that all of them share is that when we invest in communities, so do businesses and residents. Livable communities are good for families and economies. When we're talking about this specific project, Community Spaces Fund would help create a more livable rural Victoria. So again, we've taken a project which on the surface it's a new project, it's a project we may not have spoken to government about, but we can integrate it into the whole platform and part of the core mission of Rural Councils Victoria by finding the key issue and challenge that we're responding to and talking about that when we're talking to government. And that kind of messaging is resonant throughout the entire platform and throughout the advocacy that we've looked at implementing and we are implementing in the lead up to the state election. So how have we applied this messaging to our state advocacy? Well, using this framework, Rural Councils Victoria has identified 7 key advocacy areas and accompanying messages which capture all of our advocacy projects. So there are 17 different projects in that platform, which is quite a large number, and on the surface they look quite diverse. But by finding key unifying messages and themes, many of which we've already spoken to the government about, many of which are ongoing challenges that can be resolved in a variety of ways, we can develop some consistency. And Rural Councils Victoria has pulled together what is essentially a core messaging framework, which enables us to there are so many issues, so many challenges that we're trying to pull together in a way that we can easily and coherently present and understand and use as a framework. And this is the document that's come together. I don't know if this one's been distributed, but I suspect it is around and can be. And this framework also forms the core of the platform. So you'll notice that the categories in the platform match exactly with this document. And it's a way of making sure that when we talk to government, we have a level of consistency there. We have a framework that makes it easy for us to explain the challenges faced by rural councils, not only to government, but also to other stakeholders. And that might be to residents. If we're asking residents to get on board with our advocacy, we're using messages and language that are familiar to them and that are recognisable. Whether we're talking to local businesses, whether we're talking to other councils, we're able to frame the arguments that are supporting our projects in a way that matches up. It makes it easier to work together as a team, and it makes it easier for us to communicate some of those key projects. So let me just move on very quickly. So you've all got the platform in front of you, but just to demonstrate how this has a one-on-one connection with the advocacy that we've pulled together. Some of you may have already taken a look at that platform, but you'll notice that the messaging, the language directly reflects that core messaging. When we're talking about broader job offerings as a category, we have asks within that, such as a micro-job strategy for small businesses and a Main Street redevelopment fund. These look like they may have, some connection, but not a lot. But at the end of the day, the messaging that we're using and the way we're talking about these is that they both respond to the challenge of making sure that we have a broad economic offering for rural Victorians. Now, as has been mentioned a couple of times today, there has been a tendency over the past 4 years sometimes to take a bit of a kick at local government when this comes to stacking councils, when this comes to putting caps on the rates that we can implement. And what this means is it's a way for us to get our messaging outside just the box of rural councils. We can make sure we're talking about rural communities, we can make sure we're talking about rural Victorians, and it's easier to demonstrate that the needs of local government and the needs of local communities are often really closely aligned, and that sustainable rural councils are actually really closely linked with sustainable rural communities, and that messaging is also at the core. This state election platform has now been sent to party leaders, ministers, shadow ministers, local MPs and candidates, and we'd encourage you to use it, to talk about it in any conversations that you are having throughout this election period. We don't have long to go. And as you have those conversations referring to this document, please use it as a template. Please feel free to use it as a bouncing pad to start conversations. It is an opportunity to, whether it's a quick conversation or whether it's an in-depth discussion, really generate some of those discussions about the needs of rural councils, not just in the next 40 days, but over the next 4 years. So next steps. What does this mean next? It's very easy to think about, well, we've got the state election on the 24th of November, and after that, we all go down to the beach, we have Christmas lunch, and we take a break. There are many opportunities immediately on the state election to actually continue that advocacy, and many advocacy groups have a tendency sometimes to dial their advocacy up and down with election cycles and often miss quite a number of those opportunities. And what do those opportunities look like? Well, firstly, there is a budget every single year, and that represents an opportunity. And while the first budget after an election often contains a delivery of large numbers of of election promises, there are still projects that, if they have quality, will still be able to get funded, and making sure that we immediately start looking at, well, what was promised, what wasn't promised, how can we follow up in that in a budget submission. There are also parliamentary committee opportunities. There was a fantastic parliamentary committee that dealt with the sustainability of rural councils in this term of Parliament. Parliamentary committees represent a fantastic opportunity to have MPs from all sides of politics work to actually look at, in depth, some of the issues that are facing rural councils, considering how we might make submissions on what kinds of parliamentary committees we would like to see and how they might respond to some of those challenges, whether it be employment opportunities, population growth, is something we can look at post the state election, as well as briefing new ministers, shadow ministers and parliamentary secretaries. Regardless of who is successful after towards the end of November, there will likely be new staff, new ministers, parliamentary secretaries, shadow ministers. And it's important that we work on building those relationships as quickly as we can. From all sides of politics, there is a lot of goodwill in Parliament to work with rural councils, and making sure that Rural Councils Victoria presents ourselves as someone who is willing to work collaboratively is something that we can do from the day after the election. So I've tried to move through as quickly as I can. I've got my contact details up there, so if we don't have time for questions now, I'll be around, but also please feel free to send me any of your questions directly. More than happy to have a chat about anything that I've discussed here today or any of those other points that might be in the platform. So, thank you.